Jonas Staal, artist.
Boris, Buden, writer. And this is History with a Vengeance, a conversation in 7 acts.
In the post-historical period, there will be neither art nor philosophy, just the perpetual caretaking of the Museum of Human History. I can feel in myself and see in others around me a powerful nostalgia for the time when history existed. This was taken as a sort of a motto for the whole conference. And at the very beginning, I claimed that it should be taken seriously. It is a very strong metaphor, and for me, it's the fact that he uses the metaphor of the Museum of History, but then you ask yourself, why does he need to to mention philosophy and art in the same sentence and declare their end? And you think, okay, they are over, and what has replaced it? It's this caretaking. It's a curatorial job. It's a curating. What sort of curator are art and philosophy? An old traditional museum curator, professional museum curator, or the new curator, this figure of a new curator that emerges, in the 60s, that goes out from the museum to uses different discourses. This organizes big exhibitions. Think of Harald Zeman, for instance. Is this new curator that actually he or she sees the job beyond this, what is a classical task of curator, to take care of the archives, to select from the archives what will be exhibited, and to control and orchestrate discourses around.
I think what's quite crucial also when it comes to Fukuyama's understanding of what is the role of art at the end of history is a comment that a good friend of mine made, Daniel van der Velde, who always said Fukuyama's perception of art at the end of history is that of ikebana. It's that of the Japanese art of flower arrangement. Because in essence, his perception of liberal democracy is that its thesis is already complete. What we're looking for is to assemble the right orders with what we already have at hand to come to this right universal arrangement that will define the ongoing caretaking of the museum at the end of history. But then, something interesting happened when Fukuyama in 2012 wrote an article which is called Why We All Need a Drone of Our Own. And the image you see here is Fukuyama himself practicing with a homemade drone that he made in his apartment, and he made his self-portrait of himself with the drone. So that's the image that you see as part of this. And that is interesting because it shows a shift from the end of history to what I would rather call the age of the assassination of history, which is the age of the war on terror. And the drone replaces the art of ikebana. It is replaced with an art of technology that has as its key task to impose what you could call a form of deep history, which would refer to also what Jelena Vezik spoke of this morning as deep past. The drone has as its task to rewrite history endlessly in the present. So deep history is a history that is permanently re-ascribing itself in the present, and as such does not really know a history. It only knows its ongoing, immediate inscription in the reality that is the terrifying reality where we are now. Scene 2, Act 2, Innocence at the end of history. Innocence is merely non-action, like the mere being of a stone, not even that of a child.
This is Hegel from the Phenomenologie des Geistes, phenomenology of the spirit. Unschuld is, in German, non-action means nichts tun, nicht tun. And what is for me interesting, das Sein des Steines, the being of a stone. This is how innocence could be imagined. And then he has this additional, not even of a child. Not even the being of a child is innocent. And now commemorating the end of the Second World War, just as you see this picture, this is a still from a film, Germania Anno Zero, Rossellini. This boy will kill his father. At the end of the Second World War, in this art production, in the art production, there was still seriosity, how history was perceived. And I have chosen it because we have been talking also today that we how the Museum of History could be also imagined as a court where we all are the audience, and all what happens is this decision: who is perpetrator, who is victim, and that the whole history has been squeezed into this simple, totally abstract relation between victims and perpetrators, without any logic, without any understanding, of course, without politics. And innocence is, in fact, the perspective of the post-history. This is how post-history positions itself. Just to remind you, when I say Hegel, I want you to remember there is no Hegel. There was, from the very beginning, right-wing Hegel and left-wing Hegel. Left Hegelians and right Hegelians. Just to remind you, Marx was a left Hegelian.
What I understood from this citation, what is the meaning of innocence at the end of history, in the context of this museum of human history that Fukuyama proposes, is that it allows for a consciousness that makes us, despite all of self-criticism, believe that this is the best of possible worlds. And it allows us to live that presumed innocence. The innocence that, despite the fact that we know there is so much we should still change, nonetheless, there is no step further from where we are.
And in fact, it is nicht tun, non-action, not any moving within the history. It's a standstill. The Hungarian nation is not a simple sum of individuals, but a community that needs to be organized, strengthened, and developed. And in this sense, the new state that we are building is an illiberal state, a non-liberal state. It does not deny foundational values of liberalism as freedom, etc., but it does not make this ideology a central element of state organization, but applies a specific national particular approach instead.
I think the first thing that is crucial to take into account of the image of Viktor Orbán giving this speech, Prime Minister of Hungary, is the fact that he sits in front of this rather eerie-looking bear, this logo that appears on the back of his head, which relates to the fact that he is speaking at a summer university, at a youth camp. And that relates, of course, the fact that he declares here the end of history, the end of the project of liberal democracy, the end of Fukuyama's history and the beginning of another one. The fact that he does that at a youth camp touches, of course, on this subject of innocence that you related to in the previous quote. The tragedy of this citation is, of course, also that I would like to hear nothing more than a leader of a political movement declaring the end of liberal democracy. The problem is what he proposes next. a state modeled after Erdogan's Turkey, a state modeled after Putin's Russia, meaning the return of this strong father figure state which can protect this core innocence of the nation, which is embodied by the children at the youth camp, that under the guise of the new father will be able to thrive once again in all of their violence and purity, which touches upon, in the context of where I come from in the Netherlands, the beginning of the ultranationalist movement, the beginning of the new right in Europe. It was declared by Pim Fortuyn in 2001 with a book that was called De Verweesde Samenleving, which means as much as the orphaned society, a society of orphans, a society without a father figure that only lives, that has to bear the terrifying relativist conditions of the multicultural society and all of its bad consciousness about previous colonization or a history of colonization and reparation, etc., etc. And he proposed himself as the father who would once again take care of its orphan children, bringing back their lost innocence. For me, Orban is the ultimate incarnation and an even more terrifying incarnation of exactly that position.
This is new. This is the new end of enlightenment. This Kant's idea that the enlightenment, the exit is the exit of humans from the self-inflicted tutelage, immaturity. They are children, like the youth. They are children. They are absolutely innocent. What they need is someone who will represent politically their absolute innocence, which means, what is innocence? Again, nichts tun, non-action. The father, the new authority now will do it instead. The innocence of the children and people made to children is the starting point. It is this ground zero, if you like. Just to remind you, the 89 and the political scientists, the sociologists analyzed the discourses after 89, covering the Eastern Europe. They were full of these metaphors like the first steps of democracy in the nappies, the first children illnesses of democracy, etc., etc. The whole language was actually treating the people who actually themselves, who were enough mature to liberate themselves from what is called communist totalitarianism, turn overnight into children who need authority, who need tutelage.
Act 4, Remembering History. As soon as it had become possible, my father had been seriously writing to us in Bari, Italy, by way of the Yugoslav People's Liberation Army bases there, which liaised with the Anglo-Americans. Especially to me, he was painting a picture of the beautiful possibilities awaiting us in a new life. Now we are again people being appreciated on the basis of their social value and work, not of some insane racial prejudice.
This is the letter from February 1745, you see, from the Drniš military hospital, after the father of, we mentioned today, Jelena mentioned today, Darko Suvin, Professor Emeritus McGill University in Canada, who is expert for Brecht and science fiction. And in his memoirs, I found this, he mentions this letter, why I have chosen it. It's a Jewish family from Zagreb, Schlesinger, originally. They escaped. How? That his father, who was doctor, joined partisans. And then he writes, and just to repeat it. Now we are again people being appreciated on the basis of their social value and work, not of some insane racial prejudices. When I read it first time, what came to my mind is this famous sentence by Hannah Arendt in the interview, which reads, she says, if one is attacked as a Jew, one should defend oneself as a Jew. One cannot defend oneself as an abstract human being. But this is precisely, I remembered, but this was not the case. This is the answer. You know, he is not calling for a recognition of his particular Jewish identity. This is not for him a struggle for recognition. And he is obviously fighting, effectively fighting fascism. And what he says, I am now appreciated by my social values. What are social values? You know, when we are talking today about Western values, all these huge normative identity blocks explained as containers of values and identities as containers of values. This is a different world, and I want just to remind you of this difference and of something else. Then he says, where he found that in comparison to a year and a half of partisan wandering in the mountains, there are all comforts of civilized life. This is this modesty, you know, the modesty of a struggle, and this is this question: what do people really need to have a comfort of civilized life, a recognition of their social values?
I think this also touches upon the concept or the notion of multiculturalism in liberal democracies versus the potential of radical diversity or radical cultural diversity that is articulated in how you, but also Pascal Marcinich, spoke about the Yugoslav People's Liberation Army. And the fact that once gathered in a social political project, the recognition of diversity becomes a precondition rather than a problem that has to be solved in economic unification under the liberal state.
Just to say, the picture is one monument. It has survived, but because it's so massive. It is in Sutjeska in Bosnia, East Bosnia. There was a 43 battle which partisans survived the battle with heaviest losses. 9,000 died on these fields. The artists of our time are like men hypnotized, repeating over and over a dreary formula of futility. And I say, break this evil spell, young comrade. Go out and meet the new dawning life. Take your part in the battle and put it into new art. Do this service for a new public, which you yourself will make. That your creative gift shall not be content to make artworks, but shall at the same time make a world, shall make new souls, moved by a new ideal of fellowship, a new impulse of love and faith, and not merely hope, but determination.
Beautiful. That's a very well performed quote. So this is a quote written from a book written by Upton Sinclair called Mammon Art. It was published the very first time in 1924, Sinclair being a writer as well as a socialist politician. The book, the attempt of Sinclair in writing Mammon Art was an attempt to rewrite the history of art from the perspective of class struggle. He said, here at the dawn of international socialism, that's when he wrote this book, we are at a potential of leaving the prehistory of art, in which art has always served dominant powers, whether these were church or upper bourgeoisie or state. And this is the moment where we no longer think of art within the world as it exists. We need to make a step that says, Cole, we need to make the step to redefine the very material infrastructural conditions through which we imagine and make and practice and perform the possibility of a new world. And as such, what he proposes, I believe, is as much as a new worldism. The idea that we think not from the notion of what is today popular as global art, which always perceives the idea of the world as something from a potential distance, from those who have the luxury of flying from Budapest to God knows where next, but a worldism thinks from the actual structure and social relationships that make up a world, and the task of the artist in that context is to redefine a space in which a new form of social construct can come into being. That is the new worldism, which touches upon what in much later time Subcommandante Marcos has called the theory of many worlds in the context of the Zapatista struggle. The image that is placed next to it is an arena, a parliament that comes from my own work as an artist. It's part of an organization that I founded that's called New World Summit, which creates this parliaments, these arenas, platforms for stateless and blacklisted political organizations. And as such is meant as a space to claim the space of art, to claim the space of the theatre in this case, Royal Flemish Theatre in Brussels, where this was built, to narrate alternative histories, but according to the status. So it's a space where we redefine our very own compository conception of the world. Not the world as it was given to us, but the world and the many worlds as they are being fought for. All the insurgent worlds that are being fought for as we speak. They do not enter history books, they only exist in our dedication to their struggle.
Come back to, I mentioned already Kant and his text on enlightenment. Michel Foucault, writing about this text, points at one word used by Kant. Kant in German says, enlightenment is der Ausgang, the exit of a man from self-inflicted tutelage. This is a negative stance. It is an exit from what is from the existing, from the old. One has to dare. This is the point of Kant's point. Sapere aude. Not only dare to think, dare to exit of what is now and what is here. And especially, this was the same time when I mentioned it, the idea, the concept of the autonomy of art was born. And I mentioned also, born out of anxiety of the new challenges for art facing history, coming on the stage as a new subject, political claims coming and challenging the art. It was a sort not of an exit, but a retreat. And I think that this notion of exit, of daring exit, of a courage to live negatively, to live what exists. This is the way art can not only exit its autonomy, its so-called sphere of autonomy, not only exit what is today understood as art system, this global system of artistic values recognized by market, but these powerful institutions called biennials and the galleries and museums. It is also, and this is what I suggested, should dare to exit this field, which is boundless, endless field of culture, of cultural production, of time, of temporality in which we live, cultural caretaking in the museum of history, to exit into what used to be social and what is now completely opened in its idea.
And as right as Upton Sinclair was in 1924, he is today, except for the correction that we should speak of, the artists of our time are like women and men hypnotized. Act 4, Insurgent History. Art history is present.
When I read it first time, I cut it. I put aside art and saw only history. History is present. Then, we are all disciplined. You want to have whole sentence. Then I put again art back. So, okay, but art, it's a history only of art, not history. What sort of history is this now? But, it has been declared like, Dante's concept of the end of history says precisely that it is the end of the art history. What does it mean? No, of course, art is produced. It is there in our present, full of it. But the end of art, in his sense, means the end of art that in any way relates to art history. It neither continues, has the need to continue art history, nor to challenge some of the values in the art history. This is, and I will close. I think it is beautiful. Although this notion of beautiful shouldn't be used when we talk about art in its present, but it is a very strong claim. What do you think? What sort of claims?
When I was walking next to this sign in Amsterdam during this protest, I was standing next to curator Vivian Zichel, and she saw the sign and she said, I wonder if contemporary art is present as well. Which is interesting because in the nature of its own terminology, it should always be. But somehow, as has been a reoccurring issue in this symposium, it's always easier to speak of the utopia as something of the past, or of art as something to defend, as long as it is historical, than to confront the present, than to present ourselves to the present, as Judith Balso put it out so beautifully. To give a little bit of context, this is a protest that was part of the new university, which is it's a movement of student occupiers that has developed over the last couple of months in the Netherlands, and which resulted in the longest occupation of the Amsterdam University in history. It was occupied for the very first time in 1969 for several weeks. It was declared the Karl Marx University. It has been reoccupied every so many years since, whenever austerity measures were about to hit the fan. And this year, for the first time, it has been reoccupied, but for such a long time, with new universities being declared all over the Netherlands. We have about 12 of them at this moment, with a majority of teachers that joined the students, unions that joined the students, refugee collectives that joined the students. The occupation of this space of education became a space in which a potential common was re-articulated. From social movements, many of them having been discredited for a long time, especially the unions in the Netherlands, finding in that student occupation a possibility to re-articulate a common agenda. And as a result of that, students and teachers took the university under self-governance. Through assemblies, they redefined their curricula, they redefined their demands of what the new university as the only actual university of the future, of something that could bring maybe also art into its contemporary form and not only having to be celebrated as a historical remnant, into being. So, and as such, in that belief of the assembly form, or the idea that democratization of the university in essence is self-governance of the university, it touches upon, and in this protest, in this occupation, it touched upon, but it also gathered much of the heritage of protest movements from the past 10 years. I'm from the generation of the 90s. We were called the generation Nix, the generation nothing, those who were born in the best of possible worlds. But anyone who dares to still put that out to my generation and a generation of the year zero now is blind. If we go from the M15 movement to the Occupy movement, from Gezi Park to the movement of transparency activists, the new university now, we see a dialectic of movements, both digital and in physical reality, that is articulating an agenda that is an agenda of mass democratization, of politics, of economy, of ecology, of education, and of culture. And this is, I think, where the question of Sinclair touches upon the question of the new university. What does the imaginary of art contribute when it situates itself and dedicates itself and declares its fidelity to this democratization movement that is manifesting right in front of our eyes, even though reactionaries, also here among us, tend to isolate them. We say Gezi Park failed, because where are they now? We say Occupy failed, because the squares are empty. The new university failed, because the students were kicked out. That is an incapacity to see that this is a process of commonly articulating an agenda that is the agenda of progressive politics of the 21st century. And the question is, where is art's presence in that process?
Important tasks await us in the 21st century. Connect. The philosophical, theoretical, and scientific framework of women's liberation, the historical development of women's liberation and resistance, mutual complementary dialogues within feminist, ecological, and democratic movements, renewed descriptions of all social institutions, that is the family, according to liberationist principles, the field of a new social science for all those circles that are not part of power and the state must be built. This is the task of all anti-colonialist, anti-capitalist, and anti-power movements. Genealogy can build and develop the ground base of these social sciences. It is a vanguard in this regard. It will both construct the sociology of freedom and be part of this sociology itself.
So the image that you see here is an image of a classroom, and it's a classroom in the Staal Academy, the Women's Academy, situated in Jazira Canton in Rojava. And Rojava means west. It refers to the western part of Kurdistan, which today is the northern part of Syria. And I hope some of you have been following that since the so-called Arab Spring in 2012 swept the Middle East, in the northern part of Syria, Kurdish revolutionaries related to the Kurdistan Workers' Party that fought for about 35 years a guerrilla struggle against the Turkish state for their own independent state, made use of the power vacuum that appeared when Assad was forced to fight the Free Syrian Army in the south of the country and took over the northern part where most of the Kurdish population in Syria lived. And they declared this space, which is about 2/3 the size of Belgium, separated into 3 different territories, which they call 3 different cantons. They declared these 3 cantons under self-governance. They declared them autonomous, under the name of democratic confederalism or stateless democracy. The idea of democracy as something that could exist as a form of practice outside of the construct of the nation state, through assembly, through gender equal relationships, through communal economy, which is a heritage that was introduced into this new independent territory through the very prominent role of women revolutionaries and women guerrillas in the history of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the guerrilla movement. And the key of this slide, because this is not the moment to start to introduce the whole history of the Kurdish liberational movement, but the key of this quote is that it introduces the concept of genealogy, science of women. And this university, the Women's University, was built as a result of this 2012 revolution. And it was created at the heart of a revolution that refuses to demand for a state, as the Kurdish people have suffered under the enforcement of the nation-state project long enough. This university was made to redefine the field of science and culture from a non-statist perspective. It was created to narrate a history according to the stateless, not statelessness in terms of being in a position of victimization, but statelessness as a precondition to define democracy as a practice, to define an ecology of power that would not be based on forced cultural unification or territorial understanding of our identities, but that would be practiced from and would be theorized from the history of women, which the Kurdish revolutionary movement considers the first colonized class in history, colonized under patriarchal politics, which found its outer consequence in the project of the nation state, and from there relates to the lost histories of colonized peoples and anti-colonial and liberational movements from all over the world. That is genealogy, and that proves to us that if we search for a new worldism of a new science and of a new art, it means that we will have to think of that within and at the heart of an alternative political struggle. And my personal belief is that this space, that room, that is surrounded by crises and ongoing struggle of the Kurdish revolutionaries against the Islamic State on one hand and the Assad regime, but there in the heart of that space is where the imaginary of that new science and new art is being born.
As you know, we started our conversation with this Fukuyama's sentence about Museum of History. As I mentioned yesterday, the sentence is taken from his famous article published more than 25 years ago, The End of History, published first with a question mark. 3 years later, republished in a form of book without a question mark. We started this conference with the title, There is a Crack in the Museum of History. Is that how the future gets in? I want you to read now this title, looking at this picture without a question mark. Thank you.